Okay, next slide. Soil moisture. Okay, so we did evaluate soil moisture in these pastures over the 2-year period, and here's another visual representation of what was happening between the years. So the black bar is 2019 and the dotted bar is 2020, and you can see that for all of the pastures that we looked at, soil moisture was lower in 2020. When we look at early season grazing, we had a decrease in soil moisture from start to end of grazing, and that was represented a little bit less of a decline in the control pastures. But what we did see is that by the end of the season, everything was pretty much on an even level as far as soil moisture, regardless of what treatment we were looking at as far as grazing goes. Next slide. So this slide is looking at the forb cover. So what our goal was here, looking at the forbs, was for sage grouse habitat primarily. So the high importance forbs, which are represented in the light gray box, versus the noxious weeds, which are represented in the darker box. And so our interest here was to determine whether grazing had an effect on those forbs during the brood rearing season for the sage grouse. And what we found, if you look at the top 2 boxes, that's a pre-grazing from the first year to the second year. So that is representing after we had 1 year of grazing, what did it look like when we came back in the spring. Early season certainly had a bigger increase in the high importance forbs because of that opportunity to decrease the forage that was out there that was competing against these forbs and giving them the chance to grow in while there was still moisture in the system. Sorry, then again in post-grazing, and remember in 2020, we had a really dry year, and so there wasn't a lot of difference between the 2 years post-grazing. But when you come back and look at the regrowth there on the bottom, that early season grazing really does increase the forb cover out in those pastures from 1 year to the next. And so that's important to note. And also we saw a numerical increase in the late season grazing as far as those high importance forbs for sage grouse. And so the interesting thing to note is even though there were no significant differences as far as the control pasture goes, we really didn't see any difference from 1 year to the next as far as any of the weeds involved. Next slide. So here's evaluating the intensity of grazing and on these high importance forbs as well as the noxious weeds. And what we found was really interesting in the pre-grazing sampling, this is prior to grazing in both years, that we actually saw an increase in those high importance forbs from 1 year to the next when we were grazing with high intensity. And again, just remembering that we have this monoculture of dominant grasses here. So it kind of stands to reason that if we're able to remove some of that biomass and allow those forbs to come in, that they are able to do a little bit better from 1 year to the next. And then post-grazing, a similar trend, although not significant as far as the differences that we saw there. I will note though that when we're looking at the end of grazing in the control pastures, have a higher prevalence of the noxious weed type grass or noxious weed forbs in that control pasture. And so it's just something to take note of. And then of course at regrowth, we really saw a bump in the high importance forbs after we grazed really heavily during that regrowth period as well. So just follows that trend. Next slide. So we also evaluated the different nutrients involved with the forages. So looking at dry matter is the amount of forage that's available after you take water out of the equation. And so this is how we analyze for livestock nutrients. We take that water portion out and then we look at what's in the actual dry part of the forage, and that gives you an idea of protein and fiber and that type of thing. And so on these charts, the more rounded dot is 2019 and the triangle is 2020. And I hope you guys can see it okay in the room. It's kind of a small chart, but essentially what we're seeing here with dry matter is that it is higher across the board pretty much when it comes to that 2020 year versus 2019. And that's indicative, of course, of that drier year where we don't have as much precipitation. And of course, over the season, as things mature and get drier, the dry matter will go up as well. Also looking at forage biomass, a similar trend is happening here, where in 2019, we see more biomass regardless of what time of year, just because of that moisture. But we essentially started pre-grazing when we did the June grazing at a similar place as far as biomass goes. And then as we got into that later season, of course, biomass is higher because we've had longer period of time to grow. But I guess that's just something that we can expect. And most of these nutrient content analyses are. Next slide. So again, a little bit small chart, but we have crude protein at the top, followed by TDN, which is total digestible nutrients, which is indicative of how much energy is in that forage. And then the bottom two, ADF and NDF, are fiber. So we see what we would expect, which is higher protein during the June grazing season prior to grazing, and also there in the post-grazing place, higher protein levels. This is just common for earlier season plants to have more protein in them. And so as we go into regrowth, the interesting thing here is that although most of the time they're pretty similar, we do actually see a bump in protein in that regrowth from the early season high intensity grazing. And again, that is the removal of that forage and allowing it to come back and regrow. You're actually improving the quality of those plants by taking away the maturity and the stem that grows and creates more fiber in that plant. And so as far as fall forage for wildlife goes, being able to remove some of that biomass, if it has a chance to grow back, it will be good quality forage for the wildlife later on. I think that's all I really want. I mean, you see fiber increase throughout the season. And then of course, with that NDF in the early season high intensity grazing, it's the opposite of protein. It's lower just because there's just not as much stem and growth on those plants, so they won't have as much fiber in them. Okay, next slide. So we would be remiss if we did not look at how these different grazing practices affected our cattle, because as far as a producer is concerned, we need to make sure that they're not losing money on any management practice, as well as targeting these other objectives. So in the first year, we had higher gains than in the second year. And of course, that follows the trend for the moisture that we saw out on the range that year. As far as season of grazing, early season grazing produced a higher gain than late season grazing. And we did use the same animals in June as we did in August. So they would have similar growth capability. And, you know, it stands to reason the better nutrients in the feed early in the season allows them to gain a little bit better. When it comes to the grazing intensity, we did see a decrease when we grazed at high intensity in the gains that these animals were able to achieve. And then, but on the other token, we're still, these are in kilograms per day. So if we're at 0.6, you know, we're still up above a pound a day, pound 0.3, 0.4, somewhere in there, even in that high intensity grazing. But the alternative here is that we actually can graze more animals. And so the overall total gain is actually higher when it comes to how you can stock those. And so that's the trade-off there. Next slide. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the work we're doing related to willow browse. And so what happened here is I was in discussions with people a few years back about, you know, some of the willow browse and having some of the blame coming down on the cattle, where they thought maybe some of the wildlife were in there doing some of the work. And so it got us thinking, which animals really are doing the most work on willows, and at what time of year. And so we've looked in a couple of places. At Rock Creek Ranch, again, we did a trial where we had just short duration grazing. You know, I think it was 3 or 4 days per pasture, pretty small acreage there. We looked at 3 different pastures. And then we've also been looking at the Beeler Ranch, which is up in Leadore, Idaho. And there was some concerns there with the amount of wildlife that are in that area throughout the year, and being able to continue keeping those willows in a place where they're good for the fish habitat. And so that's why we started this project. Next slide. So after we did some grazing, or before and after, I should say, and then a couple of times throughout the season, late season and early spring, we took some measurements of willows. The willows were either over 6 feet tall, and we measured some of the branches on those willows where wildlife or livestock could reach them. And we also measured the total volume of the plant itself. We also measured willow plants that were under 3 feet, and we made sure to have some good data on those as well. And so we have a lot of time spent measuring willows out there. And what we also did do in collaboration with Jason Carl at the U of I is fly some drone imagery. And we were looking at, could we achieve the same volume data on these willows with a drone as we could on the ground, and that would save significant amounts of time. And so for this project, we flew the drone, and then they worked some magic. This wasn't me. They worked some magic to determine whether or not we could do that. And so these pictures here are showing you some of the imagery that we get from the drone and how things were measured a little bit. Next slide. So what we did find, we looked at allometric volume, which is essentially taking a full volume of the plant, you know, A, B, Z measurements, and getting an idea of how big is that plant in real life. And then we flew the drone and compared the imagery back, as well as looking at a 2D volume, which is essentially if you were to put a sheet over the plant, it gives you kind of the drape volume. And so both of these really resulted in a pretty confident, the drone imagery really confidently was able to match up with the value, the numbers that we had put on the ground. And so with a 90+% confidence, we can match them pre-grazing, and then a little bit lower post-grazing, probably, well, I guess I can't really speak to why that might be, but still really good confidence, around 80 or more when it comes to measuring those things. And so what we've been doing is trying to really hone in on that method, because it takes so much less time and it's still accurate enough that you can get a good picture over time what the trend is in these willow plants. Next slide. So another thing that we did was measure individual plants, and this here represents some work that we did at the Beeler Ranches in Leadore. So what we did was we started at pre-grazing, measuring how much total removal was happening in the willows over time. And so at the very beginning, we took some measurements, and that was prior to the grazing that was taking place at the beginning of June. And there had already been 6% utilization in the first couple of months of that growth period. And so that was, we attributed to wildlife because there were no cattle out there at that time. So we took also a measure at mid grazing and at end grazing, and these are cumulative here on this chart. So by the time we hit mid grazing, we've seen a bump of up to 14%, so 8% bump. And by the time we reach the end of grazing, we have 45% utilization on these plants. And we do have game cameras out there, but we have not been able to really get down to the nitty gritty on those yet. But we're contributing this both to livestock and wildlife because they're all out there at the same time. And then by the time grazing ended and we measured later in the fall, we had reached 57%. And we're obviously contributing that 12% bump solely to wildlife again, because there was no cattle out there. And so the interesting thing to note here is the difference in the type of willow that we were looking at and how much browse was happening based on the species of the willow. So you can see that, for example, the gray bar, which is a Pacific willow, when the cattle were there, it was grazed a little bit more heavily, and then it dropped off a little when wildlife came in. And I'm going to get at that a little bit more specifically, but it was certainly interesting to see the differences in the way that these plants were grazed by different species, different the wildlife and the livestock. Next slide, and you'll have to click through a couple of things, sorry. I'll tell you to click on this next one when I'm ready. So I'm going to click once. So this is the percent used during each grazing period. And so it's essentially taking what I just described, but looking at these three specific willow types. So at the very beginning, the wildlife were in there. And these are the three most common plants. And so they make up the greatest proportion of the use that we observed out there. And you can see that, click, that when the cattle were in the pasture, they really hit that plain leaf willow pretty hard as far as the type of willow that they were choosing. And then also the lutea willow. But then click again. When the cattle were removed, you can see that the Geyer willow is really the one that the wildlife continued to browse on, where the other two dropped off as far as browse utilization. And so this is really interesting to us because it tells us that we can identify the type of willow that maybe cattle and or wildlife prefer, and we can use that information when we're doing restoration work. So maybe we don't have to keep cattle out quite as long when we restore an area if we put something in there that they don't prefer to utilize. The other thing that we have been working on identifying is whether or not these animals are actually eating the willow, or if it's more mechanical, moving in and out of the willows, breaking them off as they move through them. And in an area where you have a really dense willow population, maybe that's a good thing to keep things open and growing, get some of that forage underneath to have a chance to see the sun, that type of thing. And then certainly if there's an area where willows are a problem, which, may not be quite as prominent in Idaho, but where I'm from, willows were such a pain. We're always looking for ways to decrease them. And so this is an opportunity. If we can understand which willows cattle most prefer, we can help sort of stem that growth and keep things at a smaller size. Next slide. So here's an example of some photos we took. These are taken at Rock Ranch. We have, this is pre-grazing, nothing's been out here but any wildlife that may have wanted to go out there prior. At the top, the sandbar willow, and at the bottom, the Geyer willow that was out there. Click. And so here's a really obvious image that shows we've grazed off quite a bit of the forage. We've still left quite a bit. This is after the cows have been removed, but there's a really obvious use of this sandbar willow, whereas the gyre willow really was not touched for the most part by the cattle. And so I just think it's a really cool way that we can work with these different types of willows depending on where we are and what we're trying to achieve to get to those objectives. Next slide. So one of the things I touched on earlier is that we do have game camera imagery for both the cattle and any wildlife, and those are year-round imagery, both for Ranker Rock Creek and at the Beeler Ranch. And so as most of you who've ever worked with game camera imagery know, it's pretty tedious to go through and look at all these things, but we do have them, and we are working on that. The Rock Creek Ranch project was 3 years long, and it's completed now. The Beeler Ranch project is on its 3rd year now, and we will be making a determination of whether we need to continue to look or whether we have reached our goals as far as the data that we've collected. So I'm really excited to be able to share this data when it comes available. And next slide. I think that's all I have for you today. And so I'll take any questions that you guys have, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them.
Excellent. Thank you, Melinda. If folks are on Zoom, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Or you can type it in the chat. All right. We've got our first one. Adriana, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I thought that was a really great presentation, very informative. So thank you for that. My question was, can you explain a little bit about, you said where you're from, willows are a huge pain, and you were trying to remove them. Why is that? Is that because it decreases accessibility for your grazing animals? Or I'm not familiar with that. So I just was curious.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question, actually. You know, when I moved to Idaho and willows were a problem, I was like, man, that's so weird. Because in Colorado, there's a lot more private land in Colorado, for one, and the riparian systems are bigger for the most part than they are here. Just a little bit different as far as the precipitation. We're higher elevation, getting more into that alpine type area. And what happens is we just have willows come in at such a rate. And, you know, to be honest, I don't know in those areas what type of willow it is. And maybe they're just those types of willows that perhaps the cattle really don't have any interest in, but they get big, they get overwhelming. And then it kind of inhibits the movement of both the wildlife and the cattle because they're just so thick and gnarly. So it's just a matter of being able to get through them to the water and be able to put that forage down underneath, because the canopy is so thick and tall and heavy that there's just not an ability for grasses to grow underneath. And so that's the challenge is there. And I know that there are some places in Idaho that have similar challenges, but it really comes with a big water type system. So those willows just take off. And one of the things to note is that willows, like aspen trees or any of those water reliant type plants, they really do require some disturbance to be able to regenerate and put up new shoots. And so if you have a lot of disturbance without inhibiting the growth of the plant, it does allow those plants to come in a lot thicker and a lot stronger. And so that's just something to keep in mind as well. You don't want to have no disturbance at all, or else the populations really can't grow outward, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Melinda. Colby, you had your hand up. If you don't mind, just introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Yeah, hi, my name's Colby Blair, and we have a place down here on the Little Salmon River. We're a outfitter that does fishing all around the state, but particularly in this area. So thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I kind of had to step out for a second, so sorry if these questions are redundant, but it sounds like some sort of management of things like willows seemed beneficial. Was that the finding, was that having some sort of cattle grazing coming in and try to managing that so that they didn't completely overwhelm the other plant species, was that beneficial? Just thinking about erosion, did you have any findings on to manage that, to reduce erosion?
Sure. Yes, we specifically in this project did not focus on that as an objective. At Rock Creek, we probably don't have that data just because that system is, it's very marshy, very wet. Really, it has a lot of opportunity when you graze in early July to regrow and not have a problem as far as that goes. I do think that when you're looking at a situation where wildlife or livestock are hitting those willows really hard and they're not able to continue to grow and thrive, you probably could start to see some that erosion issue that you're talking about. I think that that was the reason we did the work in Ledor, was, having that year-round pressure from wildlife. And what we're seeing just preliminarily is that there's a lot of deer and a lot of moose that are hanging out down in those areas year-round. They're not ever leaving. They're spending a lot of time. And once the grass is to nest, that's the only source of forage down there for them. Our goal was to try to just understand a little bit better, what's happening. And I think that if we have an area where we are seeing some major erosion and we are concerned that it has something to do with cattle grazing, this is where we could go like that Geyer willow, where if we can get it established, the cattle are not grazing during this. And so that gives us that opportunity to establish those a little bit better. So that would be I don't know if I fully answered your question, but that's my thoughts on piece of it.
Dean, if you don't mind, since you can hear you.
Yeah, that'd probably be better. My name's Dean Dryden, I'm Meadows Valley. Can you tell me what the size of these zones were and what the stocking rate was?
Oh, sure. So if I remember right, they were like 3 or 4 acres on the Rock Creek Ranch per pasture. And I think it was somewhere around 60 cows, but our goal was to graze to about 60% utilization in there. So we stocked it based off of how much biomass was available for grasses in the pasture. And so we did achieve that. And of course, as you know, they hit some areas a little harder than others, but for the most part, that's what we achieved in those areas. In Ledor, we really don't achieve a very high stocking rate in there. Typically, I want to say 30 or 40% at the most. And I couldn't tell the size of the pasture. It's pretty big. So our grazing in there is pretty light, though.
Okay. Now the other thing I was wondering, I was looking at your graphs and everything, and on your rotational management of those cattle seasonally, have you, since you've done this, tried different times of the year of putting those cattle in, or is this still too new? Different parts of the season.
Yeah, we only looked at June and August for that project. We are in the process of wanting to extend this project to do some more work in that area. Because I understand that there's a lot of other times that would be beneficial. The biggest challenge there was we just didn't have the space to do that many replications of different treatments. And so, and certainly it's important to keep in mind too that that was a 2-year trial, which of course is something long-term. It's not end all if it's a 2-year response, right? So we do want to look at things at a longer term, a longer duration over time to identify what the real outcomes are over a longer 5-10 year period, right? And I think adding more of those timing of grazing is important for that, because when we see really good response from high intensity grazing system, it would not be that way for 10 years if we did it that way every year, right? So it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I noticed that you were concentrating a lot on I'm going to call it the above ground. Did you take any soil profiles and root measurements on your forbs, your grasses, and your willows?
We did not, but we have talked about that quite a bit. And moving forward, we certainly have soil moisture that we've looked at already, but you're absolutely right when we look at the root biomass. And I think that's another sort of longer term question, because really those effects can be within a year or two. But when you're looking at the long-term health of a system, having more of that understanding of the root biomass is important. And so that is something that we're considering in our future directions.
Yeah, I agree with you. You need to look at the biomass, and it's probably as important as anything. So thank you so much.
You bet.
Yeah, you bet. Hey, Melinda, this is Wes. Thanks so much for speaking today. I was just going to ask you, one thing that we've seen in a lot of riparian restoration is getting started, so if you have a mature riparian, ecosystem, that kind of graze doesn't have too big of an impact because you have areas that are above the graze level. Did you guys use any fencing? Meaning, when you're trying to get started, the one thing that's difficult is sometimes you can have the graze rate exceed the plant's ability to grow. And so it just kind of it's in this stagnation or the spot that can't really seem to get past a point. So did you guys work with any fencing? And then the reason why I asked that is just, getting that willow to an ability or a height where, when you do have graze on it, it doesn't seem to impact it as much in the early stages.
Sure. We didn't do any fencing on specific willows at Rock Creek. We do have some exclosures at the Beeler Ranch, and I don't have the data on that as far as the difference between grazed and ungrazed plant growth. But I agree with you. I think that's a challenge. We did have a lot of young shoots at Rock Creek, and we saw a similar path. What type of willow it was, a big difference in how the cattle grazed on those, smaller shoots. And I do have that data that I could put together and share with you. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we're working on analyzing this data and getting a better feel for all of the different pieces about it. And so I'd be happy to share that with you guys once we get that rounded up. But I do think that there's opportunities if we have an area where, we're not being hit excessively with wildlife grazing, to implement some of those different species and be able to get that growth in without having to stop grazing altogether. In this system, to fence the cattle into the area, we just used electric fence. One of the things coming down the line that I'm really excited about from a conservation perspective is the virtual collars for cattle, which works somewhat like a electric collar for dogs. And there's been a lot of really positive use of that coming along, and there's a couple of companies that are really to the point where they're starting to sell them commercially. And to me, this is a really awesome opportunity, because you could provide the cattle with an opportunity to drink in a certain area, but exclude them from some of those restoration areas. And so maybe we can combine some of these management tools that we're starting to see, plant gyre willows and put virtual collars on cows in sensitive areas. And I hope that that's the future, because I think that could be really an awesome way to combine these different industries and allow for everybody to still get what they need out of them.
Awesome. Thank you, Melinda. Any last questions before we go to lunch? Okay, so Melinda, we've got your email. Again, thank you. We've been trying to get Melinda to come as a guest speaker for 3 or 4 months now. So we really appreciate you making the effort, and especially during lambing season. So
Well, I really appreciate it, and I would love to come back at some point with some more information for you guys if you'll have me. So
awesome. Thank you very much, and take care.
all right, bye.